So anyway, so the scenes of people desperately fleeing Kabul shows how many Afghans were actually terrified of the Taliban, and for good reason. But while the Taliban are imposing their rule on Afghanistan by force, you cannot really run a successful 18-year insurgency against a superpower without substantial bases of support. So why do many Afghans actually support the Taliban, and what is by all objective accounts and measures a horribly oppressive regime? One of the main reasons is actually their legal system and their approach to law and order. The Taliban's implementation of Sharia law, and by the way, Sharia law is Sharia is law in Arabic already, so it's like law, but for a Western audience it makes sense, but is best known and the best feature of their regime. They impose a deeply misogynistic and very violent version of Sharia, placing extreme restrictions on women activity and imposing brutal punishments for men, women, and children alike. This is often described as the most strict interpretation of Sharia, but this is actually misleading. For most of the history of Sharia, while certainly treating men, women, and children unequally and very bad, and employing a corporal punishment for men, women, and children, a lot little like the extremist version promoted by the Taliban today. So, for example, take the most notorious punishment, the stoning to death of adulterers. This is indeed a theoretical valid penalty, but historically it was rendered incapable and implicable via a procedural law. The only valid proof was that 4 free male Muslim eyewitnesses of impeccable integrity who actually had to see the penetration like a pin in the mascara pot. So the thing goes in the hole, and that is sex education over. So in the unlikely event that such a witness or witnesses actually exist, the jurors said it was morally preferable to refuse than to testify, as there was literally no way to do this. If a witness testified and the prosecution failed, he would be punished with 80 lashes for false accusations, and if the prosecution actually was successful, he would have to throw the first stones. If someone confessed to adultery, the confession would have to be repeated 4 times, while the judge actually urged him or her to actually retract the statement. While it is impossible within the intellectual framework of Sharia to simply abolish the penalty, because there was actually a clear text saying that the Prophet did it, the jurors could not actually make it any clearer that it should not be news. So if this seems paradoxical, there was another clear text that the Prophet told his followers never to impose a punishment if they could not find a reason not to. So this dynamic, which is the harsh text softened by prophetic examples, is actually pretty common in all Abrahamic religions. It is really exemplified by Jesus' statement that he who is without sin shall cast the first stone. So what this means is that unless you are holier than thou, literally almost Jesus Christ, you cannot throw the stone. Now, this can be very interesting and is very often news, but if you're on equal standing, say, why are you doing drugs? You shouldn't be doing drugs. You shouldn't be doing drugs, and I say, well, I never did any drugs in my life, so I have the moral authority. But on other stuff where it's not so clear cut, you shouldn't really be casting the first stone. But judge and ye should not be judged is actually kind of paradoxical when it's within itself, because you can't really judge on behalf of the Lord, but at the same time you can cast an earthly judge if you are a bit more like, well, in that space or in that thing that you're judging somebody for, if you're morally correct, then yeah, you can, but it must be coming from a place of love and not actually beating down the person, right? So there's that. It's like a judge, it's a critique, it's not actually tearing down somebody as well. So alright, religious lesson over. So accordingly, there's almost no records of examples of stoning being carried out prior to the 1970s, when the radical Islamist revival was actually taking place throughout the Middle East. Now, so similar techniques were used by the Jewish to actually avoid or even blunt out many of the harsher punishments found in Islamic scripture texts. When the British took over Bengal in the late 18th century, their main complaint about Sharia law was that it was too difficult to have people executed. Of course, the British, exaggerating Sharia. Oh wow, interesting, right? Now seriously, far from the strict interpretation of Sharia, the Taliban and other extremist groups often have a radical interpretation based on rejecting 1,000 years of judiciary precedent. So there's that. So now to the main question of the video. You know about Sharia, you know about law, you know about sex ed, you know about religious ed, but why do Afghans actually support the Taliban? Well, of course, alright, we don't start with America first. Good. So why do many Afghans actually support the Taliban? So why do many people actually support the Taliban? Does this mean that they want their women locked up in their homes or stoned or lash people? Some do, but many don't, and actually don't support or even contest the Taliban rule anyway. But why? Well, first off, you're under a totalitarian theocracy, so if you speak out, that's bye-bye. But a more detailed view of why. So while the Taliban's rules are clearly unjust, the other measures of a legal system is whether it is just on its own terms or not just. So are the rules applied consistently? Can people enforce whatever limited rights they have? Do judges favor the strongest claim or the biggest bribe? So on these measures, the Taliban system actually ironically scores well, especially when compared to other legal regimes and regiments that are offered in Afghanistan. The Taliban's pitch to the population has always been a legal system that is harsh but fair. To understand why this actually cuts through and actually cuts deep, we must first appreciate the extraordinary scale of devastation and violence visited on the Afghan society and Afghanistan people during the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. Around a fifth of men aged between 21 and 60 died during the Soviet-Afghan War, or the Soviet War in Afghanistan. All men, and not just combatants, they were shot. In provinces bordering the USSR, 16% of the entire population actually died. By the end of 1987, 44% of the surviving population were actually refugees, and mostly women and children. So the Afghan refugee crisis has continued unbroken ever since, and many Afghans have been displaced many times. Only in 2015 were the Afghans overtaken by the Syrians as the largest refugee population in the world. And even that is starting to slowly go back down. So anyway, after the fall of the Afghan communist government in 1992, there was a civil war and the country was ruled by the rival warlords who had led different factions in the anti-communist Mujahideen. In many regions, the state had effectively collapsed. Afghans were extremely vulnerable and life became next to impossible to live. Farmers had their land stolen, merchants and craftsmen couldn't even enforce contracts, and there was widespread looting and extortion rackets, murder, rape, all that stuff. Law was non-existent. So here comes the Taliban. As any insurgent would claim, the Taliban offers security and a legal system that work. A functioning, reliable legal system, even one as oppressive as the Taliban's, allow people to engage in the economic activities necessary to sustain themselves better than a hopelessly corrupt legal system, or even no legal system at all. So the Taliban has often interpreted in terms the extremist ideology, but offering an alternative legal system superior to that of the official one, is a classic insurgency strategy seen in numerous other places. The IRA, for example, and the FARC, for example, did the same thing during the Irish War of Independence and the Colombian, the bad times of Colombia, the violence, the La Valencia. So in Afghanistan, it's taken the form of Sharia because that is what available and that is what really is clicking with the cultural script. But the reason of why it works is less to do with the ideology and more with the service it provides. This analysis of the Taliban was actually well known to the US and their coalition allies, who poured extreme and enormous resources into building a justice system during the occupation, as described by Frank Ledwig in his book Rebel Law. But the attempt actually failed. In much of Afghanistan over the past 15 years, Afghans have had the choice of resolving disputes in the court or the new government, the village elders, or the Taliban. In many places, it was consistently chosen the Taliban. So the reason for the government, which was unable to actually establish a credible court system, are very complex. One clue of the reports on Friday is that the defeated president Ashraf Ghani flew into exile with a suitcase containing $169 million in cash. Whatever and whether this is true or not, Afghanistan will find it hard and will find it believable. Afghans would find it believable and not a stretch of the truth at all. And for the corrupt government of Afghanistan, and now the corrupt government of the Taliban, law and order is all but assured, but at what cost? Anyway, guys, gals, NB, I hope you enjoy that one. Just a quickie. It's raining, pretty much in a tropical storm. I'm not gonna get washed away, but as you can hear outside, yeah. But I think I'll finish it here. It may or may not come out. I don't know. I just want to see if it sounds good. I do feel a bit stifled, but it was pretty good. I think I should have opened my mouth more, but that is the cause, and that is what it is. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. It has been a blast. I'll see you next time. Learn something.